The string quartet's melody floated through the grand stone church, weaving its steady tall arrangements of ivory roses of the guests, and the soft rustle of Isabella stood at the far end of the aisle. Grace stood at the fingers curled tightly around a bouquet of white lilies, trembling slightly in her hands, slow and deliberate. She forced her breathing promised to herself slow, she wouldn't cry, focusing on the rhythmic rise, not in front of the music. Every face in the crowd was a reminder of the life she had lost control over. Her uncle sat in the front row, eyes fixed on her with a warning that needed no words. It was his voice, his threats, that had brought her here. Her family's debts had become her chains, and marrying Victor Kane was the price demanded to set them free. Victor's reputation preceded him. A man of immense wealth, with business interests that reached far beyond the law, he was spoken of in tones of caution. Stories of his ruthlessness were traded in the city's elite circles like currency. People said he could break a man without raising his voice, and now he was waiting for her at the altar. Isabella lifted her gaze and found him there, tall, broad-shouldered, and impossibly composed. His dark suit was tailored with precision, his tie knotted without a single flaw. He didn't smile, he didn't look away. His eyes locked on hers, steady and unreadable, as though measuring every step she would take toward him. She expected to feel fear, the kind that turned the stomach cold. But instead she felt something else entirely, a strange, unsettling calm. It was as if he wasn't looking at her like property or collateral, but as someone he had no intention of harming. It didn't make sense. But in that moment, it was the only thing keeping her moving forward. The aisle felt impossibly long, each step echoing off the stone walls as Isabella moved toward the altar. The murmurs of the guests faded, replaced by the distant rumble of thunder. Her gown whispered against the floor, a sound almost in sync with her heartbeat. Victor didn't move as she approached, but his gaze never wavered. It was not the hungry, possessive look she had braced herself for. It was something far more measured, as if he was studying her for reasons she couldn't guess. When she reached his side, the officiant began the ceremony without delay. His voice was steady, but Isabella could barely focus on the words. Her mind drifted to the moment she had first heard Victor's name. Whispered warnings from a friend, rumors of deals sealed in private rooms where laws did not matter. She had imagined a man with a cold, cruel demeanor, someone who would relish having power over her. But standing beside him now, she sensed a contradiction. There was danger in him, yes, it radiated from his very presence. But it wasn't directed at her, not yet. When it came time for the vows, Victor's voice was deep and even. "I take you as my wife," he said, the words clipped and formal, but lacking the sharpness she'd expected. He didn't reach for her hand until it was required, and when he did, his grip was firm, but not crushing. Her uncle's watchful eyes burned from the front row, reminding her why she couldn't run. The debt, the threats, the shadow of everything her family had lost. It all anchored her in place. And yet, for the first time, she wondered if Victor Kane might not be the kind of man who needed to hurt her to keep her. The ceremony ended with the polite applause of guests who were more curious than celebratory. Outside, the rain had eased into a fine mist, casting the world in a silvery haze. Isabella stepped into the waiting black limousine, the leather seats cold against her skin. Victor slid in beside her, his movements precise, unhurried. For a moment, the only sounds were the hum of the engine and the rhythmic patter of rain on the roof. Isabella kept her gaze on the blurred city lights beyond the window, unsure if she should speak first. "You don't have to be afraid of me," Victor said suddenly, his tone quiet but certain. She turned to face him, surprised by the calm in his voice. "I wasn't given much choice in this marriage," she replied, her words careful but not meek. His eyes held hers, dark and steady. "Neither was I." The admission unsettled her. She had assumed he had orchestrated everything, that her uncle's desperation had been an opportunity for him to take what he wanted. But the way he said it, flat, without bitterness, suggested there was more to his involvement than she understood. As the car wound its way through the city, she noticed small details about him. The way his cufflinks caught the light, the faint crease at the corner of his mouth that hinted at fatigue rather than malice. He didn't crowd her or demand her attention. Instead, he sat with the stillness of someone who knew the value of patience. When they arrived at his estate, a sprawling mansion of stone and glass, Victor stepped out first, offering his hand to help her. His touch was brief, polite. It was not the beginning she had expected from a man everyone called dangerous. The heavy oak doors of the mansion swung open with a quiet groan, revealing a grand foyer bathed in the golden glow of chandeliers. The marble floors reflected the light in soft ripples, and a sweeping staircase curved upward into shadow. Isabella stepped inside, her footsteps echoing in the vast space. Victor led her through the foyer without a word, his stride measured. Staff members appeared silently in the periphery, a butler, two maids, their faces polite but unreadable. They acknowledged her with slight nods before retreating into the background. At the end of a long hallway, Victor stopped before a set of double doors. "This will be your room," he said, pushing them open to reveal a space more like a suite than a bedroom. Pale cream walls, a carved canopy bed draped in silk, and tall windows that opened to a view of the rain-slicked gardens. A fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth instantly softening the room's grandeur. She stepped inside cautiously, half expecting some unspoken condition to follow the generosity of the space. But Victor lingered in the doorway, his hands in his pockets. "You can lock the door from the inside," he added, as if anticipating her thoughts. "I won't come in unless you invite me." Isabella turned toward him, unsure whether to believe the words. "Why?" she asked quietly. His expression didn't change. "Because this isn't a prison, and you're not here to be hurt." Without waiting for her reply, he stepped back into the hall, pulling the doors closed behind him. The firelight danced across the walls, and for the first time since the wedding began, Isabella felt her shoulders loosen, not in trust, but in the absence of the fear she had expected. Morning light spilled across the canopy bed, soft and golden, warming the edges of the silk sheets. Isabella woke slowly, half expecting to hear footsteps outside her door or the weight of someone's presence in the room. But there was only silence, a stillness broken occasionally by the distant sound of water running through the old pipes. She dressed simply and opened the double doors to the hall. The mansion felt different in daylight, less like a fortress and more like a museum. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, revealing the subtle wear on the marble steps, the faint scuffs on the baseboards. As she wandered, she began to notice things she hadn't the night before. In the library, rows of leather-bound books lined the walls, but between them were framed photographs, not of business meetings or political events, but of children in schools, families in distant villages, and buildings that looked like they had been rebuilt after disasters. In one frame, Victor stood beside a group of volunteers in a flood-ravaged town, his sleeves rolled up, his hands covered in mud. The man in the photograph looked different, still imposing, but less guarded, almost human. She moved deeper into the library and found a desk covered with neatly stacked documents. On top lay a faded newspaper clipping. Local Tycoon funds rescue mission abroad. The article was short, but the image showed him holding the hand of a young boy, smiling in a way that made her pause. Footsteps approached. She turned to see Victor standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "You're free to go anywhere you like," he said, his tone calm, "but be careful with the stories you believe about me." He left before she could respond, leaving her with a strange truth. The most dangerous thing about Victor Kane might be how little she truly knew him. The day unfolded quietly, but Isabella couldn't shake the weight of Victor's words. "Be careful with the stories you believe about me." They lingered in her mind as she explored the gardens in the late afternoon, their stone paths winding through manicured hedges and old oak trees. The air smelled faintly of rain and earth, and for the first time in days, she let herself relax until she heard the voices. They came from beyond the tall, wrought-iron gates at the edge of the property. Two men stood just outside, their shapes distorted by the bars. She couldn't make out every word, but fragments drifted through. Debts. Doesn't know yet. Dangerous for her. Her stomach tightened. She stepped closer, but before she could get near enough to hear more, the men noticed her and moved off quickly, disappearing down the road. When she returned to the mansion, the butler was waiting in the foyer, his hands clasped behind his back. "Mr. Kane would like to see you in his study," he said. The study was dim, lit only by the fire and a single desk lamp. Victor looked up as she entered, gesturing toward the leather chair opposite him. "You saw them, didn't you?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded. "Who were they?" "People who think marrying me makes you vulnerable," he said evenly. "They want something, money, leverage, and they'll use fear to try and get it." Her pulse quickened. "Then why not tell me from the beginning?" Victor's gaze held hers. "Because I didn't want you to believe they were the reason you're here. But now you need to know. The danger isn't from me, Isabella. It's from everyone else." The words unsettled her, not because they sounded false, but because deep down, she suspected they were true. That night the rain returned, drumming against the tall windows of Isabella's suite. She sat near the fire, watching the flames shift and crackle, replaying Victor's words in her mind. "The danger isn't from me. It's from everyone else." Sometime after midnight, she heard it, the faint crunch of gravel outside. She rose slowly, moving toward the window, and pulled back the curtain just enough to see the faint outline of a figure near the outer wall of the gardens. Whoever it was, moved with purpose, not like a wandering passerby. She pressed her hand to the glass, trying to steady her breath. Before she could decide whether to call for someone, the door to her suite opened without warning. She turned sharply, but it was Victor. He closed the door behind him, his voice low but urgent. "Stay away from the windows." "What's going on?" she whispered. He crossed the room to her, his expression sharper than she'd seen it before. "They're testing the perimeter. Whoever was at the gate earlier sent someone back tonight." Her heart thudded in her chest. "Why? What do they want from me?" "They don't want you," Victor said, his tone clipped. "They want to see how far they can push me." He moved to the small cabinet near the fireplace, unlocking it to reveal a concealed panel with a security monitor inside. One of the cameras showed a shadowy figure retreating into the darkness beyond the wall. Victor shut the panel and looked at her. "You're safe here, but you need to understand. Marrying me put a target on you, even if I never wanted it that way." And for the first time, Isabella began to wonder if staying by his side might be the only way to survive. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the gardens glistening under a pale sun. But the calm outside didn't match the tension that hung in the air within the mansion. The staff moved with a quiet urgency, as though they, too, knew that something had shifted during the night. Victor was in the foyer when Isabella came downstairs, speaking in low tones to two men she didn't recognize. They were dressed in plain, dark clothes, but their posture and sharp, scanning gazes told her they were more than ordinary employees. When Victor saw her, he excused himself from the conversation and crossed the marble floor to meet her. "I'm increasing security," he said without preamble. "2 guards on the property at all times, cameras upgraded, and the gates reinforced. No one gets near you without my knowing." She studied him, trying to read the expression beneath his composure. "You're acting like this is just business, but it isn't, is it?" His eyes flickered with something, frustration maybe, or concern. It stopped being just business the moment they involved you. He led her to his study, where a large map of the estate was spread across the desk. Red circles marked entry points, while small black dots represented camera placements. "They're testing me," he continued, his voice calm but edged with steel. "They think you're my weakness. What they don't realize is that keeping you safe is the one thing I won't compromise on." The words caught her off guard. She had expected control, perhaps even possessiveness. But there was a different weight to the way he said keeping you safe, not as an obligation, but as a choice. For the first time since the wedding, Isabella felt a flicker of something she hadn't thought possible with Victor Kane. Trust. The days that followed took on a new rhythm. Isabella was no longer left entirely to herself. A quiet but constant presence shadowed her movements. The two guards rotated shifts, discreet yet always near, and the staff's eyes lingered just a little longer whenever she passed. It should have felt suffocating, but strangely it didn't. Victor was often in his study or on calls, his voice low and deliberate, speaking in languages she didn't recognize. Yet somehow, he still found time to appear at moments she didn't expect, walking her through the rose gardens in the late afternoon, joining her for breakfast in the sunroom, offering her a book from the library that he thought she might enjoy. One evening, as the last light of day faded, she found herself in the music room, idly pressing the keys of a grand piano. She hadn't played in years. The notes were hesitant, uneven. "You used to be better than that," Victor's voice teased gently from the doorway. She turned, startled. "How would you know?" He stepped inside, his eyes softened by a rare hint of amusement. "Your uncle once bragged about your recitals when you were younger. He conveniently left that out when negotiating our marriage." She rolled her eyes but couldn't hide a small smile. "Well, I'm out of practice." Victor moved closer, resting a hand on the piano's polished edge. "Then, practice. No one here will stop you." It was such a simple offer, yet it felt like a small freedom. She nodded, her fingers returning to the keys, this time with a little more confidence. As the notes filled the room, she glanced at him, standing quietly, listening. For the first time, the space between them didn't feel like a boundary. It felt like the beginning of something neither of them had planned for. 2 days later, the fragile sense of calm shattered. Isabella was in the conservatory, trimming a pot of lavender, when the sudden crack of distant gunfire split the air. It wasn't loud enough to be inside the property, but close enough to send her heart racing. Within seconds, one of the guards appeared at the doorway. "Mrs. Kane, we need to get you inside, now." She was ushered through the corridors toward Victor's study, where he was already speaking rapidly into a secure phone. His voice was sharper than she'd ever heard it, every word precise, clipped. When he hung up, his expression was unreadable, but his eyes carried an edge she recognized from whispered rumors, the look of the man people feared. "It wasn't here," he said, answering the question she hadn't yet asked him, but it was close, too close. She hesitated, then asked, "What are they trying to do?" Victor leaned back against the desk, crossing his arms. "Send a message." "What message?" "That I can't protect what matters to me." His tone was steady, but there was something raw beneath it. "Years ago, I dismantled a smuggling network that cost some very dangerous people a lot of money. I thought that chapter was over. I was wrong." The admission sat between them like a live wire. Isabella absorbed his words, realizing this wasn't just about debts or intimidation. It was about an old war flaring back to life. "They think you're leverage," he continued. "They're wrong. But until I end this, you're not stepping outside these walls." She should have felt trapped, but instead she felt an unexpected certainty. Victor Kane might be dangerous, but his danger wasn't aimed at her. It was aimed at anyone who dared to threaten her. That night, the mansion was quieter than usual, the staff moving like shadows in the dimly lit halls. Isabella found herself wandering, unable to sleep, her thoughts tangled between fear of the unknown and the strange, growing trust she felt toward Victor. She paused outside his study, the door slightly ajar. Inside, Victor sat at his desk, the fire casting long, warm shadows across his face. His jacket was draped over the back of the chair, his shirt sleeves rolled up, and for the first time, she noticed how tired he looked. Not the fatigue of someone overworked, but the weight of a man who had carried too much for too long. In his hands, he held an old photograph, a woman with dark hair and kind eyes, smiling at the camera. Isabella recognized the resemblance immediately. "Your mother?" she asked softly from the doorway. He glanced up, not startled, but as though he'd expected her. "Yes, she died when I was 20. She's the reason I built all of this, and the reason I protect it." She stepped inside, her bare feet silent on the carpet. "She must have been proud of you." Victor's gaze returned to the photo. "Maybe, but she wouldn't have liked the things I had to do to keep it all, the things I had to become." There was no bravado in his voice, only truth. For a moment, the dangerous tycoon everyone feared wasn't sitting behind the desk. Just a man who had lost too much and learned to hide the parts of himself that still hurt. Isabella moved closer, resting her hand lightly on the desk. "You're not the man I thought you were." He met her eyes, something unguarded flickering there. "Neither are you." It wasn't a threat. It was the beginning of understanding. The following morning, the light in the mansion felt different, warmer somehow, though the clouds still hung low outside. Isabella found herself in the breakfast room, seated at the long mahogany table set with silverware and fine china. Victor entered a moment later, not with the commanding stride she'd come to expect, but with a quieter presence, as if the weight of the previous night still lingered on his shoulders. He poured himself coffee before taking the seat beside her, instead of at the opposite end of the table. "You didn't sleep much," he observed. "Neither did you," she replied, meeting his gaze over the rim of her teacup. There was a pause, filled not with tension, but with something gentler. The silence felt less like distance and more like shared space. For the first time, she noticed the subtle softness in his expression, not weakness, but a willingness to let her see past the armor he wore so well. "You don't have to thank me for last night," he said. "Keeping you safe isn't something you owe me for." "I know," she answered, setting her cup down. "But I want to." His brow furrowed slightly, as if he didn't quite know what to do with her sincerity. "Most people don't want to see past the surface," he admitted. "They find it easier to believe the stories." "And I'm not most people," she said. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, the kind that seemed rare for him. "No," he agreed. "You're not." The air between them felt charged, not with fear or mistrust, but with the quiet pull of two people realizing that whatever bound them now was no longer just the terms of an unwanted marriage. The day passed without incident, but the memory of the previous night's conversation lingered in Isabella's thoughts. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, she stood on the balcony overlooking the gardens. The scent of wet earth and blooming roses drifted up from below. She heard the door open behind her and turned to see Victor. He stepped outside, his presence steady but no longer looming. For a moment, they simply stood side by side, watching the last light fade. "I never wanted this marriage to feel like a cage," he said quietly. "I know it began that way, but I think it doesn't have to end like that." Isabella met his gaze. "It doesn't feel like a cage anymore, at least not with you." He looked almost relieved, though he masked it quickly. "There are still dangers," he admitted. "But if you'll let me, I'll face them with you." Not for you, but with you. The distinction mattered. It was a promise of partnership, not possession. She turned fully toward him, the golden light catching the faint lines of wear on his face, the marks of a man who had fought battles in boardrooms and alleyways alike. "Then we face them together," she said. For a long moment they simply stood there, the silence between them no longer heavy, but full of possibility, of trust that had been hard-won, of something that might one day grow into love. Somewhere deep inside, Isabella realized that the man everyone had warned her about had been the one person who refused to harm her, and perhaps the one person who would fight hardest to keep her safe.